Okay, the key points from the last lecture. We're looking at a hierarchical model, top-down model, cognitive model, whatever you want to call it. So if you believe in this model that there's a central executive in the brain that controls all the movements, that has the motor programs, that has the ultimate control for the body, the ultimate control over those degrees of freedom, then you as a therapist should try to reestablish this higher center control, because this is the part that we really need to have working. So to get that higher center work again, we're going to have to suppress those low-level reflexes, those inappropriate reflexes that have emerged after the stroke, after the traumatic brain injury, whatever it is, because that injury has prevented the top-down approach, prevented the top influencing those low-level spinal reflexes, for example. So when you're doing that, your treatment from an NDT, pure NDT approach, the original sort of ideas is not quite as popular now, but originally the concept was to follow motor development up the stages. So this is what you're looking at. Here's a patient with stroke with these. If you're trying to influence tone, if you try to influence equilibrium, these are the steps you'll follow up with a patient who had a stroke. So now they're down here. You have to try to inhibit these and facilitate, inhibit, etc., and get up to the higher level cortex. Okay, so in essence, the patient with stroke has been kicked back down a developmental scale to a baby, as it were, and they have to follow these developmental steps back up to reestablish this higher center control over these lower levels. Because again, it's these higher center control is the most important. Okay. We went over some implications, some limitations of a pure hierarchical model. If you believe the brain is the total arbiter, the complete arbiter of movement, it has all the say-so in how a person moves. How do you explain how the cat with its cut midbrain can walk on a treadmill, have these phase-dependent reactions, shake his paw in swing phase, walk with 3 legs, walk with 2 legs on one side of the treadmill going faster than the other, etc., etc. There's a lot of movements this cat could make, and other animals have been shown to do this without the brain attached to the limbs. So that's a difficult way to, a difficult problem for a pure top-down approach. Research has shown, though, that if you do suppress these reflexes, like Berta Bobath had said, in that stepwise progression, you don't get normal movement. So you can give Botox the heck out of a kid's spastic diplegic legs, and you're not going to get normal movement, even though the tone is gone. So they would argue that that's the tone. The tone is the issue. If you get rid of the tone, the higher center can now reauthorize or reinitiate normal gait. That doesn't happen, unfortunately. This notion of context dependency means that if you believe motor programs are stored within the brain in terms of muscle commands, you can make a movement, throwing a ball or whatever, from multiple multitude of places in the environment. You can have multiple different initial conditions. It depends on the context how that motor program is going to work. In certain contexts, that motor program won't work if the arm is in different position. So in essence, you'd have to have millions, if not billions, of motor programs stored to allow you to move in all contexts. That doesn't seem logical to me. Degrees of freedom. Okay, the brain is very, very smart, yes, but I think there are still too many degrees of freedom for a central executive control. That is my feeling. Other people believe it's fine. We looked at development of gait. Esther Thalen has shown that when you put a baby, when you stand a little infant on a tabletop, he or she will step in an early infancy, in a month or so. But a few months later, that stepping reflex disappears. The NDT approach, or top-down approach, says that reflex has been integrated and the big brain has taken over and stopped it working. But if you then get that same kid and put him in a swimming pool with water up to his waist, the stepping reflex re-emerges, suggesting it's not an integration issue. The brain hasn't integrated, hasn't taken over that, because it's still there when the kid is walking in the water. So how do you explain this? Well, Thalen said the reflex is not integrated after a few months. In fact, it disappears because the baby is put on weight in the legs, put on fat for insulation essentially, and has not developed the muscle strength yet to be able to move those legs in that same stepping reflex. You put the baby in the water, buoyancy helps, and therefore there's less force needed in the muscles to generate that stepping reflex, and therefore the baby will step in the water. If you put the baby in a gravity eliminated position, the baby kicks and steps kind of in space as if it's walking. But because it's a gravity eliminated position, the force required on those muscles is less. Okay, so this is showing that this kind of Thalen's work shows that there can be peripheral constraints of the weight of the legs, constraints of gravity, etc., that can influence movement. Movement is just not only influenced by the brain. My last comment was how much cognition does a cockroach has. So a cockroach, is a very, very low animal, can do lots and lots of motor skills essentially without a brain. You can pull legs off a cockroach and it can still walk. How is that done when the cockroach does not have a brain, does not have a higher center executive? And my argument would be that the mechanisms that explain how a cockroach walks can also explain how we walk. Just because we have a big supercomputer does not mean we have to use it for basic actions like walking. So that led us to the dynamic systems model, to try to explain these degrees of freedom, what they'll say there is that humans, like many other animals and other complex systems in the world, are self-organizing, complex, and non-linear. Okay, so the degrees of freedom, in essence, self-organize themselves into a solution, into a motor response in this case. Like the termite hill is built by the muscles, which are the termites, which are very dumb. They do not have a master plan. There's no brain telling them how to build a termite hill. They do it by themselves with simple rules of movement or of organization. And that the rule that governs a termite hill building is, drop the dirt where you smell the most pheromone from previous termites, and that will result in a big spire being developed. A tornado, lots of different responses we can see in the world, very, very complex responses, beautiful are made without any brain controlling them, no central executive. And that is what we would talk about as a dynamic system. So a tornado is a dynamic system, a human walking is a dynamic system, a cockroach is a dynamic system. Okay, so some examples when you get into this, in early learning, a dynamic systems theorists would say we freeze the degrees of freedom, all those lots and lots of muscles, lots and lots of nerves that can activate. We freeze them together in units, sometimes called coordinative structures or synergies. We freeze them in a soft manner, so they're not permanently frozen. They're softly assembled or softly frozen, as it were. So a car front wheels are permanently frozen together, hardwired, as it were. They're hard frozen, so that one wheel turns to the right, the other wheel turns to the right. That's a permanent assembly of a synergy. But in humans and the nervous system, we have this soft assembly. Okay, so we temporarily link parts of the body to work together. It makes it easier when we've linked them together. We're only controlling one thing rather than two, as it were, like the car wheels, for example, with a steering wheel. You'll see this, for example, in T-ball, in young children trying to play T-ball. The way they swing at the ball, they will co-contract the elbows, the wrists, the forearms, whatever, the shoulders, and freeze them in one unit, and therefore they just control the bat, let's say, with rotation of the trunk. By freezing the arms and wrists and hands as one unit, that's very easy to control because that's one signal that in essence contract maximally. And now we made the task easier for the child by only having to control trunk rotation, for example. In handwriting, you'll see this when you sign your name with your dominant hand and non-dominant hand. The effectors you use, the limbs, the joints you use when you sign it with your non-dominant hand, you'll find them different from the dominant hand. You'll stiffen up the wrist, for example, and control the pen with the shoulder or the elbow. So that's freezing degrees of freedom in early learning. And in cerebral palsy gait, we talked about how, from a dynamic systems perspective, you want to find a solution to the problem you've been given. And that can self-organize that solution given the resources and the constraints impinging on that child at that given time. So remember, we mentioned this at the very beginning of the semester, a child with CP is born without inadequate control, born with inadequate control of the gastrosoleus complex. So you can't get push-off. There's no impetus for driving gait. A lot of the impetus for gait comes from that push-off of the plantar flexion. So what the children will do is self-organize the system into two pogo sticks in the gastrocs. So they make them into passive springs sort of thing to allow them to bounce off those springs using kinetic and potential energy. This allows them to get around the world because they do not have active control of push-off. So from East's perspective, the way you treat this would be very different if you believe in a dynamic systems model in which that hypertonicity in the gastrocs is a strategic adaptation versus a byproduct of the stroke or the CP, the lesion. So you'd, from a hierarchical approach, that spasticity or that hypertonicity is a problem that you have to get rid of by Botox or stretching or baclofen or whatever. From a dynamic systems perspective, you want to work with that to try and improve the strengthening. You want to try to improve the active capacity of the gastrocs to generate force. If they can generate a push-off, there was no need to have a pogo stick. Okay. So finally, what we started talking about was we can see what a dynamic systems perspective would argue that is that people's movements, patients, how they move, emerges out of a function of the constraints and resources they have rather than prescriptions. Prescription approach is a top-down approach. The big brain prescribes using motor programs what the person should do, how the muscle should move. All the commands for movement come from this brain who has a plan for moving. A constraints approach looks at how is the person constrained to move, what constraints influence the emergence of a movement pattern. And those constraints, they are called holonomic. It means completely by law. Laws of physics can help us move, show us how we move. We can get a lot of movement for free without using motor programs or higher non-holonomic constraints, which uses the brain powers needed for these. There's no brain power needed to understand how my arm swings from high to low position using a pendulum. That would be laws of physics. Holonomic constraints are dictating how my arm moves, not a motor program. So expanding on that notion, we can see constraints come from the environment, the organism, the person, the patient, the cockroach, whatever it is, and the task. Each of these constraints can dictate, help in the emergence of the movement. And so those constraints, task, environment, organism, interact to allow a movement to emerge out of the function of those constraints. Those constraints can involve a whole wide variety of things. In the patient themselves, when they bring to the table their strength, their height, mass, range of motion, their fear, the psychological, physiological constraints, all those will dictate how a movement is made. These will constrain how a movement will be made. The resources will dictate how a movement is made, how strong they are, how happy they are, how depressed they are, what their aerobic capacity is, their weight, the length of their arms, length of the legs. All these things help constrain the movement, help reduce the degrees of freedom in essence. The environment will change the way a person moves. Walking on ice versus walking on sand, versus walking on wood, versus walking on a shag carpet, etc., all will change the way a person moves. The strength of gravity will change. The medium the person's moving through. Are they trying to move through water? Are they trying to move through air? Are you walk on the moon? Whatever. All the medium which you're walking through, or the amount of gravity will constrain the way the person moves. The lighting, the temperature, noise, all these things constrain movement, help to reduce the degrees of freedom. And the task that you give your patient to do will change the way they move, how fast they have to move, how accurate they have to be. These kind of things will help constrain the movement. And so, again, we see movement responses emerging out of the interaction of these constraints, and on the flip side, the resources that allow these tasks to occur, these movements to occur. The very last slide we looked at was that when a movement, for any given movement, for example, walking, hopping, skipping, throwing, whatever, to be able to develop, to emerge, let's look at, in this case, locomotive development, the emergence of gait in an infant will depend on the number of resources and constraints they have. Each of these constraints or resources does not develop in a linear manner. They're all non-linear, and I've just made these sort of curves up just to show the non-linearity. So, for example, all these constraints or resources have to have achieved a certain level, a certain threshold level before gait can emerge. So in this case, for example, I've just gained hypothetically postural control. Well, let's pretend it goes up like this. A baby will not try to walk if a postural control is down here. So in this case, if the baby instantly falls over, has no success whatsoever, can't support the body weight, hasn't have the balance to maintain a single step, the baby will not try to walk. So postural control, balance, whatever you want to call it, has to have a certain level for the baby to have success, and then the baby will try to walk and start learning to walk if they can maintain a certain amount of postural control. They've got to be motivated, for example, to walk, to move, to get to the toy. Okay, they've got to be able to adjust muscle tone. They've got to be sensitive visual flow, and we talk about that, and we'll get into that next class again. Body constraints, you've got to be, all these sort of things, and there's many, many more, have to have a certain amount of threshold achieved before locomotive development can occur in a child. The same can be said for, not the same, particularly the same constraints here for a person walking with a stroke, or an adult throwing a ball, or whatever. All these systems have to be at a certain threshold for that movement to emerge. And one day, and 1 week, it might be their balance is not good enough to walk. Another day, a few weeks later, it might be the strength is gone, or the motivation is not there. So on different times, each of these constraints could be the deciding factor, could be the limiting factor. We have to find what is limiting a patient's movement. So in this case, it could be, for this baby, it could be the postural control, for example. And we'll talk about more, give examples of this next class.